Hi class. So I'd like to go over now quasi experiments. So remember with our ABA studies, we're looking at this as a single case study. But I may want to collect data on multiple participants. In this case, I would be likely to use a quasi experiment, particularly if I want those realistic behaviors, but I can't engage in random assignment. So now I can have some of the sort of aspects of an experimental study, but maybe not so much with the hallmark of an experiment, which is that random assignment. Now, the reason why we might engage in a quasi experiment is because it might be difficult for us, or maybe even impossible for us to actually have that random assignment. And so think about this as an example. I want to do research in an educational setting. Well, I can't actually decide what classroom the student is going to be in. I can't decide what the teacher or who the teacher is. And so in this way, I don't really have all of the same amount of control that I would in a full experimental study. And so in this case, I would use a quasi experiment because I want to take a look at one particular behavior. In order for me to do this, I would engage in a pre-test, post-test design. And so in this case, my behavior is actually measured twice. Once before the treatment occurs, and then I will give my treatment, and then I'm going to take a look at that treatment after. So we would do a post-test assessment. Now again, this is a quasi experiment because I'm not doing any random assignment. And so my participants are going to get that treatment. And then what I'm actually doing here is I'm comparing my scores before and after my treatment to see if my treatment had any effect. So let's kind of take a look at this with an example. So we can do pre-test, post-test designs for many different types of experiments. One you might look at is maybe smoking cessation, but without random assignment, it's really hard for us to decide, if my treatment works, right? Or if the groups are exactly the same. And so it might be kind of hard for us to conclude that the program caused changes in smoking behavior. And so one thing we can do are these quasi experiments here, and doing so with a pre-test, post-test design. But let's take a look first at our post-test only design. Now here we would have our participants. And then let's say that our independent variable is sitting next to a stranger. And then our dependent measure is how long it takes a person to leave. Okay, so we engage in the behavior and we take a look at how long it takes the person to leave. Now, this is a post-test only design because I am taking a look at my dependent variable only once, and I'm doing so after my independent variable. If I have a pre-test, post-test design, now I take my participants, and just like we talked about before, I'm going to give them a DV, or their dependent variable first, and then I'm going to give them the independent variable, and then I'll test the dependent variable again. By doing this type of design, remember, I can take a look at the difference between my scores on my first assessment of their smoking, and then I can compare that to their second assessment of their smoking, and I can see if there's any difference there. So this kind of gives you a reintroduction to that pre-test, post-test design, but thinking about how we might be able to use that within the confines of a quasi-experiment. Your book then goes on to talk about different types of research designs that we can use in developmental research in particular. Now, the reason why we oftentimes use these types of research studies with developmental research is simply because with development, we're trying to take a look at change and look at change in behavior over some period of time. Or we might be taking a look at that behavior as compared to others, right? So this ends up being a really good area to look at different types of study designs that we might not have talked about previously. So one study design that we can use is something called a cross-sectional design. In a cross-sectional design, we have children of different ages that are measured at the exact same time point on the exact same variable. So let's say that I'm taking a look at my vocabulary scores, and I want to see how well children are able to do on vocab, just what vocab they know. So I can compare a 2-year-old to a 4-year-old to a 6-year-old, and I can see, if their vocabulary tends to increase. Now, by doing a cross-sectional design, I only have to spend one time point looking at data, and I can see how that vocabulary might change across the lifespan, right? Or in this case, over the next 4 years. There are some problems with this type of design, one being that it doesn't take into account cohort effects, and these are effects that might target a particular group of people. So in that example I gave you, they did a very similar study with kids, and they did it with elementary school kids, and then into high school, and then into early adulthood, and they gave vocabulary, and one of the words that all of these 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds were getting was provincial, but our older adults weren't getting that word. Many of them tended to not know what it meant. It turns out that around that time, Beauty and the Beast had just come out, and Belle had sung about her provincial life. And so because of that movie that affected a group of individuals, those children were more likely to know that vocabulary word. And so on the surface, it might actually appear that our 11-year-olds might be smarter in some aspects in comparison to some of our older individuals in the sample, when in actuality, it was something that affected those group of people. Unless you know what it is that's affecting that group, it's really hard for you to be able to make some of those conclusions. And so this can be a part of the issue with our cross-sectional research design. Another type of research that we can do is a longitudinal study. And in our longitudinal study, we end up following one group of people over time. So here we have our individuals who were born in 1955. We take a look at them when they're 55 years old in 2010. We then follow them with 2015 when they should be 60 years old. And then we follow them in 2020 when they should be 65 years old. And we give them the same assessment at each of these different time points. Now, remember, in our cross-sectional, we're comparing our 55-year-olds who are 60 to 65. So each of these are different groups, but we're able to kind of see if there's any changes or differences that are happening. And remember, with our longitudinal design here, we're following the same groups of people over time. I'm going to talk to you in just a second about some of the negatives that might be associated with this. Our third method is a sequential method. This is where we combine both of our cross-sectional design and our longitudinal design together. So here we can compare our 55-year-olds to our 45-year-olds, right? So we're comparing these groups, but we're also following them over time. So we can compare 55 to 65, 60 to 7. We can compare here our 55-year-olds when they become 60 and when they become 65. Then we can compare 65-year-olds as they become 70, and then they become 75. But the really great thing here is I can also then end up comparing my 65-year-olds to these 65-year-olds. And of course, if I followed them along, I could do the same with my 70-year-olds, and then the 70-year-olds here, and then the 75-year-olds and the 75-year-olds here. So now I'm not only just following groups of people over time, I can compare these groups to each other. By doing this, I'm actually able to pick up if there are any cohort effects, which would have been masked in my cross-sectional design and my longitudinal method. In terms of pluses and minuses, in my longitudinal design, longitudinal research tends to be pretty expensive. It takes a lot of time to do. You might have participant loss along the way. And so it becomes very, very intensive. In comparison, my cross-sectional research is relatively cheap. My results can be picked up pretty quickly, but remember, I might have those cohort effects. If I do my sequential design or my sequential method, as you see here, now I'm combining the best features of both my cross-sectional and my longitudinal work, but just like with my longitudinal designs, I'm spending a significant amount of money to collect data. I will still have participant attrition, which can be a problem as well. And so each of these designs has their positives, but they also have some negatives as well. So this brings us to the end of our chapter here with our developmental research. So for chapter 11, of course, I'm happy to answer any questions you all have, and I look forward to seeing you all in class here soon. All right, have a good one. Bye.